Thank you all. I will try to go very quickly through the presentation, which was originally meant for a longer slot. The topic of my talk today is introducing the Digital Markets Act, which is a new regulation of the European Union, which will affect anyone offering internet services, at least if they want to offer them into the European Union. And so we will start by explaining why these and other regulations were conceived in the last 3-4 years by the European institutions. And so I'm going to show you the perception of the internet industry, especially of the global internet platforms, as seen from Brussels in around 2019 when the new European Commission was elected, which is a pretty different view than what you might see from here or definitely from the Silicon Valley. So basically this starts with a long list of complaints, but the basic thing that really raised an alarm bell with the European institutions was this. I mean, for the first time in history, actually, in the last years of the last decade, we had 5 tech companies from a very limited part of the world being the 5 biggest listed companies on the planet. I mean, there have always been very big technological companies already like one century ago, like AT&T. But this was the first time in which basically all the biggest companies were technological companies. And the Chinese ones were also coming up. Now, this has slightly changed. I left the numbers, the ones in red are the market capitalizations about 1 year ago, which was sort of the peak. But you see that sort of at the peak, I mean, Apple was worth like $3 trillion, which is more or less France's GDP. And even if comparing a GDP with market cap is like comparing apples and oranges, but still this gives you the feeling that some of these companies were being perceived as basically as big as the biggest European countries, or even bigger in terms of economic power. And so this, the European governments were not happy about this. But why is this? This is because of consolidation in a number of disruptive innovations that happened in the last, let's say, 15 years. And the biggest one was for smartphones. When smartphones came, again, it was a platform for innovation, and there were millions of people literally trying to write millions of apps. But then it consolidated pretty quickly. So now we have like only two mobile operating systems, and even in the apps sphere, like the messaging sphere, many of these apps are owned by the same company. And this creates, of course, economic mass, but it's not just about the apps or smartphones. So this is the cloud market. This is already old. But in the cloud market, there are basically 3 companies, more or less the same, that are owning like more than half of the market or 2/3 of the market, depending on the various estimates. And this is just getting worse. And then there were, of course, complaints about the transfer of wealth that this is creating. So this is a chart that was calculated in Italy a few years ago, but it's more or less the same in any European country, about how many taxes, do the internet platforms actually pay in the country. And this is one of the biggest concerns for any European government. So if you see, thanks to a series of, invoicing that happens internationally, both within the European Union and then outside of the European Union, in the end, the actual revenues that are taxed in each European country are relatively low. Like in this case, it's about 1/7 of the total revenue, which was 750 million euros for Google in advertising in this specific year. And so, that is sort of calibrated with the cost. So in the end, the actual margin is pretty low, and the actual tax that they pay is pretty low. And so, of course, when this is replacing national services, provided by companies that have their legal place of business and pay all the taxes in the country, this is a net loss for the tax revenues for the country. And on the other hand, there were indicators, this again is a proxy indicator, but in 7 years, the prices of houses in central San Francisco went up, multiplied by 2.5 times. So this is really a sign of a global transfer of wealth going on from Europe, from all the rest of the world, into a very specific part of the world, which is, it's now the US West Coast, but of course could also be China, or maybe these are possibly the only 2 places where companies like these are emerging. And so this is what we like to call Hotel California, in the sense that this is a system in which all these companies, more or less always the same, are providing services that are built in a way that you cannot leave them, cannot literally live without them. So you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave the services of these platforms. And why? On the technical level, this is because the recent services, the ones that were developed in the last 15 years, were developed in a different way than the traditional internet services. So a traditional internet service like email or like the web is interoperable, meaning that you get an email address from a provider and you can exchange email with anyone else from any other provider. And anyone can offer services, all the standards are open, there are open source implementations, and you just bring up your email server and start to exchange email with everybody else. But if you have a look at the more recent services, they were built as walled gardens, as silos. So instant messaging is the classic example. So you have many instant messaging services, but they don't talk with each other. So if you want to talk with people that are using WhatsApp, you need to install WhatsApp and become yet another WhatsApp user. And then you need also to install Telegram to talk with Telegram users and Skype and Signal, whatever. And you basically cannot move. So, I mean, if you move to a different instant messaging service, you lose your contacts, you lose your conversation. And so you don't do that unless you have very, very good reason. And actually, there were studies on people trying to move away and basically giving up. And this is maybe not even the standards are closed, but the deployments are closed. So these applications are designed not to interoperate. And then there's other business practices that have the same purpose in the end. So like bundling applications together. So in mobiles, you get your phone, which is a mobile operating system by one of the two dominant providers. And they also give you the apps. So it's very hard to compete on the apps because, I mean, the app of the platforms will come pre-installed and integrated on your phone. And so for anyone else that wants to provide a different one, I mean, good luck in convincing people in installing it. I mean, it can happen, but it's hard. And everything is so integrated that you cannot just replace individual modules. And so this has created, at least in the perception of the European Union, a concentration of power. I mean, it's economic power, but it's also more than that. It's actually control over the economy and over who gets to also enter the market, control the development of new startups. And now this is getting worse because our homes are filling with stuff. I mean, objects, generally also made by the same platform, but not only, that are bringing up encrypted connections to the cloud and moving data across borders out of jurisdiction, if you believe in your jurisdiction. And it's increasingly impossible for the user to know what's going on, which data are being transmitted, why, and what is being done with them. And so in the end, this ended up being a long list of complaints by the European institutions on what these platforms do. Because in the end, they have power which is not just economic power. It's really about being able to track citizens through, targeted advertising and getting into their privacy. It's about political power over choices, because especially the social media arena, controlling which news and how they spread and what gets moderated and what does not get moderated, or who has accounts or sees their account closed, is a way to control the public opinion, and so also impact democracy. And jurisdictions, so being able to make laws and enforce them somehow, and national security, because of course, if you have very big platforms that get to see everything because everybody in your country is using them, then you literally get to know also all the secrets of the country. And so this is why the European Union started to act. And, we are now introducing the concept of digital sovereignty. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. I mean, it's become all of a sudden a real buzzword, at least in Brussels. So everybody, especially German and French government and the European institutions are talking about digital sovereignty. So what is this? There are actually two slightly different concepts of sovereignty. They are slightly different depending if you see them from Paris or from Berlin. But in the end, they both together form the concept of European digital sovereignty. So part of it is about autonomy. So in a way, the ability of European countries to be self-sufficient, not depend on foreign products, even if they come from friendly countries. But still, for any reason, even just business reasons, the American platforms at a certain point in time might decide, for example, to stop offering you search services and turn off their search engine. And what happens then? Your society, your economy will stop. You literally can, the European economies and societies cannot live without these services today. And so you're trying to become autonomous by fostering the growth of our local digital industries, local alternatives that can be provided locally. And this is also about sovereignty in the proper sense. So being able basically to make rules, make laws through your democratic processes, and then get these companies to abide by them and collect the tax, which is a basic element of democracy. And so not depend basically on anything which is outside of your control for something which is so critical for the survival of your own society. And so there's a long list of requests. So you will see, I will briefly mention now all the different initiatives that are going on in regulatory terms in Brussels. But you see that there's a bit of everything. So from taxes, to sharing data, to stop tracking people, to, startups, competition, more economic issues. And also there's all the disinformation, fake news thing, which is, it's controversial, but still has an impact on democracy. And there's also finally the discussion, yet another very hot discussion on lawful interception and whether, European law enforcement agencies should somehow be able to intercept communications like they do for investigation with the phone. And here is where open source comes into play. Because, this is, I like to show this slide also throughout Europe. Because it's really like as if open source were conceived for Europe in a way. Because the European Union is still this archipelago of very different countries, languages, markets, and so there's no way that it can generate a very big company like the big American and Chinese markets can do. It does generate alliances of smaller companies, SMEs, in which in the bigger countries maybe there are bigger companies that can bring people with them, but then there's someone doing stuff everywhere, and you do this through cooperation and horizontal cooperation and alliances. And so this is why there's a lot of alliance between the European open source industry and the lawmakers that are pushing these views, because in the end, the industry, the open source community is trying to promote the open standards, the federation, and so open alternatives that are not centralized and owned by a single other company competing with the platforms, but are really distributed and open. And then, of course, you have to rely on regulation to be able to compete, so to break some of these practices that are basically making competition impossible. And so this is one of the remedies. Again, not a remedy for all the long list of things, but we are getting nearer to the digital markets act, which is a specific, only tackles a specific part of the complaints list. So the remedy is basically getting back to the original internet principles and trying to get these new services to work like the old ones. So, if you can separate this bundling of services altogether that you cannot divide, then maybe you can replace individual blocks. So maybe you will not be forced to, for example, if you're an app developer, give Apple 30% of whatever you sell within your app, because traditionally they force you to do that. They force you to use their own payment gateway and they take 30%. So if you could just replace the payment module without touching everything else, then you could have competition for the payment module. And for new competitors, they wouldn't have to replicate everything to be able to compete with you. They could just compete on that specific service. And this also, of course, requires that changing modules is made easy for the user. And the same for messaging. So if you could get all the instant messaging apps, or at least the dominant ones that have all the people in them, to interoperate, then you could try to create a new applications. Today, if you want to create a new instant messaging apps, of course it has to be good. But even if it's very good, it's hard to convince someone to try the 11th messenger app. And even if you do, they try it and there's no one in them. You cannot talk with anyone because there's no one literally using them but you. And so if you can at least make so that someone can create a new instant messaging app that can send messages and exchange messages with people using WhatsApp or Telegram or whatever, then the chances that you can succeed in competing for this market are much higher. Again, it's not going to be easy, but at least you have some chances to compete. And this would also be good for privacy, for user-friendliness. And it will also be good for things we care about, which are not just business. So in terms of sustainability, it doesn't really make sense to run 10 different apps that are basically identical, except for the color of the buttons. It's just a waste of energy, resources, battery, whatever. And for diversity, if the standards are open, just think at how many email clients or web browsers exist. There are very few of them that are very common, but there are many of them which are special, which were designed for special communities, in minority languages, in whatever. And you could actually, as a community, run your own instant messaging server with the policies that you want, rather than relying on WhatsApp or whatever. And so, let's come to the Digital Markets Act. Let me see. Yeah, we still have some time, hopefully. So, of course, the solution the typical solution by Brussels for everything is regulation. So there's a long list of acts that are coming on. So these were already approved last year. Digital Markets Act, which is the one focusing on competition, but also the Digital Services Act, which is more on liability, social media moderation, and the Data Governance Act, which is the first tile in a set of data sharing rules, and cybersecurity requirements in the NIS2 directive. But there are many more coming. So this is just a totally incomplete list of things that are being discussed now in the European Parliament or Council or the institutions. So as you see, there's more stuff on data, there's more stuff on security. I'm not going into this in detail. But there's really a lot of things. Some of these are good, some are actually bad. There are a couple of these proposals which are really bad for open source, and we're trying to stop them or at least get them modified. But I mean, there's still a lot of effort to create more and more rules around the internet services and platforms. And even more, there's a cryptocurrency regulation which will maybe come this year. So computer chips, tax directive, whatever. So let's come to the Digital Markets Act. So this is already law. It's approved. It's getting into force. It has some deadlines. Some things will only apply in 1 year, 2 years. So what is it? It only affects very few companies. So it will only affect the gatekeeper online platform companies, which are defined as very big companies, like a handful of them. But the impact on everybody else, including maybe companies in the UK that want to compete with these companies on services in Europe, in the European Union, is that they will enjoy the opportunities that this new law should hopefully create. And it's a sort of a new antitrust instrument because these dominant positions, I mean, there are people that claim they are not really dominant positions in the traditional sense, so that, iOS is not a monopoly, but this was meant to address this. So the idea is that you define a few companies as gatekeepers, having this power of control over the internet. And these are the criteria. So they have to be very big, like 75 billion euros in market cap or 7.5 billion in revenues and 45 million consumers, 10,000 business users. They have to be used by businesses to reach out to consumers. This is because of the way EU treaties are designed. And they have to provide at least one of the 10 core platform services that you see there, covering everything from marketplaces, e-commerce, flights, whatever, search engines, social media, video, browsers, instant messaging, cloud computing, so a bit of everything, all the main services that we enjoy today at the consumer level. And if your company falls within this list, then there will be a lot of things that you cannot do. And again, I don't think we have time to go into detail. Maybe I still hope we have some time for questions, so we can get more in detail. But you see that these are like ways to forbid these companies from doing the business practices that were conceived as unfair and that have created their dominance on the market, and so that prevent others from challenging their market position, including the bundling of services, including the bundling of logins, identification, payments, and so on. Then, this is a first list of obligations that are immediately active, but then there's another list. These are also immediately active, but they need technical specifications. So some of these are technically tricky, or at least they need to be specified. What do they actually mean in practice in the current market situation? But again, they are about self-referencing, so like forcing you or promoting your own application through your own dominant services and competing unfairly. There's a right to uninstall, so you can uninstall the platform apps from your phone and install your own, and you can change the default apps easily. There's a prohibition of restrictions on the access to hardware, which is something Apple especially often does. So but then finally, there's the interoperability part, which is this was literally the result of pressures by the European open source community. So there's an entire article added to basically make messaging interoperable. Not just messaging, not just instant messaging, but even for email now, anyone offering email from a dominant position will be required to open and interoperate and not reject messages from anyone else. And of course, making instant messaging interoperable requires some technical work. The standards are already there mostly, but there needs to be a lot of specification and understanding what this means in practice. So there's a schedule. Immediately in the next 6 to 12 months, the interoperability will come for text messages, and then you will add group chats, and then you will add voice calls and whatever. And so there are still things that need to be understood. In general, what does this mean, and especially how do you keep this up to date with the market, with the technical changes? So there will be the need for someone that understands the technical aspects of this to actually define which standards are going to be used, for example. And especially in terms of instant messaging interoperability, the discussion is, should each of the gatekeepers like WhatsApp, Messenger, and iMessage, whatever, should each of them just open up their own proprietary interface, which would make interoperation more difficult, or should everybody converge on a global open protocol, which would make it much easier for startups and non-profits to interact with everyone? And then also there's this idea that if you want to interoperate with WhatsApp, you have to sign a reference software contract with them, and it's unclear how a non-profit open source project, for example, can sign this kind of document, but this is still to be understood. So this is a very quick introduction to the theme, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Vittorio. While people have a think about whether they've got a question, I've got a quick one for you. So do you think the Digital Markets Act is fit for purpose as it stands in terms of mandating interoperability, or do you think it could go further?
It was already a bit of a compromise. I mean, the initial request, we wanted it to cover social media as well. Then there was some concern about how do you check information, disinformation. So the agreement was, let's start with instant messaging, see how it works, and we will discuss if then we can extend it to social media in a few years. Whether it will work, nobody knows. This is a big experiment in regulation. Nobody's ever attempted this before. In a way, the European Union is leading the world not in innovation, technical innovation of startups, but in innovation and regulation. And so we don't know. I mean, it also depends whether in the end the gatekeepers, the global platforms will cooperate, will try to make this work, or whether they will try to make this not work. Because, of course, they might be tempted to just try to make this fail. And we don't know that yet.
Lovely. Thank you very much. Yeah, there's a question down here.
Thank you. To what extent is the UK mirroring some of these regulations that the EU is leading on, if at all? I don't know.
Yeah, this is also an open question. I mean, at this point in time, I don't know of any real attempt of this, but at the same time, I mean, last June I was at the CMA conference in Canary Wharf, and they were actually asking us, what is this about, and do you think this could be a good model? And so I think there's someone somewhere is thinking of this. At least they will look and see whether this is successful or not. In a way, this will influence all the British internet industry anyway, because, I mean, you just want to also provide your services to countries in the European Union. And so, of course, as I said, I don't think that there's any British company being directly impacted, so falling, in the set of criteria that make them a gatekeeper. But there will be many that will try to exploit opportunities. And just to mention one, which is also here around them, the people from Matrix Element, who have an open and interoperable instant messaging system, they will possibly benefit from the fact that we are opening up in instant messaging.
And I think we just had one other question.
Hello, I work mostly to design impact strategies for such regulations and others. And just curious to know, when it comes to digital regulations, are there any outcome indicators in particular or impact indicators which you use to measure the outcomes after these are actually passed, or are they thought of at the planning stage at all?
Well, the European Union has some mandatory review of every regulation they make. So after, I don't remember if it's 2-4 years, there has to be a study trying to understand whether this changed the market or not. In this case, I think it's easy. I mean, if there are new apps and the market actually opens up and there are new competitors, then it has been a success. Otherwise, it will not be a success. So. There are more questions?
Yeah, I think we've probably got time for one more quick one.
My question is on the triggering point, because it's based on the number of countries served or the volume or the revenue. But won't these larger companies kind of, split themselves into subsidiaries to get around that?
They could try tricks, but it would be, I think it's hard to make it. By the way, the law says that these are guidelines, but there's still the possibility for the Commission to declare as gatekeeper someone who is not meeting those criteria, because exactly they think that they meet them in substance and not in numbers, but they do meet them. So.
So I've been working in open source and open standards work, both for government and for the private sector as well, and technology companies. As we look at digital sovereignty and this initiative in Europe, and you look at what the technology companies have been doing, they have a skill and they have been honing what they do for many, many years. They have the technologists, and I know that those technologists are not, all throughout government either. Is there a danger that what we're doing here is replicating, and that with digital sovereignty that we end up replicating across each country because everyone wants this term digital sovereignty around their information and their data?
Well, indeed, it is a challenge because we were born, or maybe not born, you see, but the internet of the first, let's say, 30 years, the mass internet of the first 30 years since the 90s, has been a borderless internet mostly. And this is somehow changing, I agree. So exactly because this has become so pervasive that no country can just afford to say, okay, I'm going to get everything from outside of my borders and from foreign companies. And if it's a sad concept in a way, but it is there to stay. So the point is actually seen from the community, from the industry. Can we find good ways to satisfy this quest for some sovereignty without breaking the internet? So finding ways, for example, to accommodate different national regulations within a single global service and app and whatever. So, replicating is not necessary. Especially if the project is open, everybody can still contribute to the global open source code base. So I'm more worried about some of these rules that are trying to create barriers to the circulation of code. Those are really bad. Those are really dangerous. But in terms of services, I think if we have more services that are federated and are local, I think we only have to gain. I don't think that the web is bad because it's not enough centralized into the hands of two companies.
Lovely. Thank you, Vittorio.
Thank you.